Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Bob Ward, pollster and partner at Fabrizio Ward. Bob, thank you so much for joining me. It is another conversation between you and I of another close race. The AARP has a new poll out of North Carolina, and this shows that the race is tight and this swing state is considered a toss-up. What can you tell us?
Very competitive race in North Carolina. On the presidential side, we have Donald Trump leading Kamala Harris by 2 points. Trump's getting 48% of the vote, Harris 46% of the vote. And then Stein, Cornel West, Oliver, each getting a point apiece. It's very competitive. Lots of dynamics under the hood, if you will, going on in the presidential race. Of course, you can't look at a race in the South without looking at it through a racial lens. And Kamala Harris has got a very commanding 74-point lead among black voters in North Carolina, but Donald Trump's got a 25-point lead among white voters in North Carolina. And so there's that sort of defines the race. The other thing that's interesting in the race is, and there's an education gap everywhere that we poll these days. The education gap in North Carolina is cavernous. If you have a college degree or more, you're voting for Kamala Harris by 26 points. And if you don't have a college degree, you're voting for Donald Trump by 19 points. That's a net 45-point education gap. And it's big. Education is really, along with race, sort of defining politics in North Carolina today.
That's really interesting. Another interesting gap are older voters, age 50 plus, and you're seeing them skew Trump. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, and here the race comes into play as well, because, Trump is leading among voters 50 plus by 9 points. So the older part of the North Carolina electorate is more Republican, and that's true in every single race we tested. But among older black voters, Harris's margin actually goes up. She's leading older black voters by 88 points, and older white voters, Trump's leading by 36 points. And so that racial disparity overall is even more polarized among older voters. But because there's more older white voters in North Carolina, edge goes to Trump among that key demographic. And older voters are going to be the largest segment of voters in North Carolina.
We've talked about older voters a lot, and in every single poll you and I have talked about, you have found that they are largely motivated to vote, more so than the younger voters. Is that true in North Carolina?
It's definitely the case. Now, I think as the campaign has gotten closer to Election Day, motivation numbers have gone up across the board, including among older voters. But there is a gap between older and younger voters. So we ask people, how motivated are you to vote? 10 out of 10 means extremely motivated. 91% of voters 50 plus say they are 10 out of 10 extremely motivated to vote. That number's 78% among voters under 50. If you look at the youngest side of the electorate, the voters 18 to 34, it's 67%. So there is still a pretty big gap between the motivation levels of older and younger voters. Older voters are going to show up. Younger voters, there's still some question mark as do they show up in the full force that they're appearing in our poll.
That's really interesting. And if I were working on either campaign, the Harris campaign or the Trump campaign, I would hear that number, hear, hey, this is a toss-up race. Older voters are more motivated to come out and vote. Maybe we should talk more about the issues that matter to them. And you and I have talked about this a lot. Those issues are Social Security, family caregiving, amongst others. Are they the same in North Carolina?
Even more so. And so North Carolina, this is, I think, the first state where we've polled, when we asked that list of like 13 issues, which is the #1 most important issue, where Social Security is actually ranked higher among older voters than abortion and reproductive rights. It is the single #1 issue among black voters 50 plus, bar none. That is the number one issue. And so it really does stand out here in North Carolina. The other issues that we've seen in other states do present themselves as at the top of the list. Immigration and border security, which is, of course, a big issue among Republican voters and independent voters. And then the economic issues, jobs, inflation. Those are also at the top of the list and do lean Republican. So if you're picking one of these economic issues, you're voting for Trump by a 24-point margin, which really tells the Harris campaign that she needs to compete on economic issues with older voters to narrow some of these margins. Of course, she's running away with it. If your number one issues are Social Security, abortion, reproductive issues, threats to democracy. Those are all big Democratic issues. But the economy is sort of writ large, the big thematic issue of this campaign in North Carolina and elsewhere.
I do now want to turn to the governor's race in North Carolina. The Democrat here, Josh Stein, is ahead of Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson by 10 points. And this was taken before a really disturbing report came out from CNN showing that Robinson left really vile remarks on a porn forum, including calling himself a black Nazi. What did your poll find?
Right. So this poll was taken after the presidential debate, but before that blockbuster story on Robinson. And even during that time, it is unlikely that Robinson was going to win this race. He's down by 10 points. How people in the state viewed him was particularly negative. He had 44% of voters in the state viewing him unfavorably, and only 33% viewing him favorably. And Josh Stein, who's ahead by 10 points, actually has fewer voters in North Carolina who know who he is or have an opinion of him. So that 10-point gap has really been driven by bad press stories about Robinson, even up before that CNN piece. Of course, were we to poll right now, I'm sure these numbers would be worse. But they had already been, a lot of this had been baked into the equation prior.
I had seen at least one Josh Stein ad that just ran remarks of what Robinson had said. It didn't even have Josh Stein in the ad. But are you saying that there's less ticket splitting and more so Robinson is just largely considered a weak candidate?
Well, I don't think we can say that entirely. North Carolina actually has a history of electing Democratic governors while almost exclusively voting, with the exception of Obama, voting Republican in the presidential elections and U.S. Senate for that matter. So I do believe that he won statewide elective office as Attorney General. He's replacing a Democratic governor. But for Josh Stein to run those ads, I think the theme of his campaign is vote for me, I'm not him.
And what about congressional races? What are you seeing there? Is there more ticket splitting? Are voters in North Carolina going more red over blue? What does that look like?
Very competitive. I think the state, the Tar Heel state is split almost evenly as a whole if they're going to send a Republican or Democrat to Congress. I think the Republican has like a 1-point advantage overall. It's a little bit higher among older voters. But it really, is another data point on how competitive North Carolina is. You've got a competitive presidential race. You've got this, sort of even split on, who you're going to vote for Congress. We tested the Attorney General's race. That's a 4-point race in favor of the Democrat, which features 2 members of Congress running to fill Josh Stein's seat. And so North Carolina is actually really competitive state up and down the ballot, and people are, choosing Republicans or Democrats as they go down the list.
We have been talking about competitive state over competitive state for the past few months now, but is what you're seeing in North Carolina really consistent with the numbers you're seeing in the other swing states?
By and large, yes. Because North Carolina is a southern state, and I did mention sort of the racial dynamics, there is some difference to why it's a battleground state. It's competitive because there's such a powerful black vote in North Carolina. And a lot of the other battleground states where the white vote is more dominant, it's very competitive. But it's not competitive when you isolate white voters versus black voters. There's completely different campaigns going on here. And so that does make it, I think, a little different. Georgia, we saw a lot of the similarities that we're seeing in North Carolina. The share of the black vote in Georgia is a bit larger. It's like 33%, where North Carolina, it's like 20%. So that, I think, is definitely setting North Carolina aside as being a little bit different, but more like it's, a southern battleground state, Georgia.
There are 16 electoral votes up for grabs in North Carolina. Is this a must-win state, and who does this help more in their path to victory, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
Well, it's a must-win state for Donald Trump. If he loses North Carolina, that really complicates the map for him. And so if Harris wins, it opens up more doors for sure. So I would say that, it is a high priority for the Trump campaign to maintain this lead, the small lead that he has there, because if he doesn't, then it makes things much more difficult to get to 270 electoral votes.
Bob, I know you have eyes really everywhere between now and November 5th, but when you're looking at North Carolina, what specifically are you looking out for between now and Election Day?
Well, I think later polling than what we've presented here today to show whether or not Republicans maintain their level of motivation, because in our poll, we talked about how older voters are more motivated to vote, but there is not a motivation gap between Republicans and Democrats. Should the Robinson issue, deteriorate the motivation on the right, that's a big problem for the Trump campaign. And so I would be looking at that as we, head into the last few legs of the campaign here.
Bob Ward, per usual, I appreciate all of your numbers, you coming on and breaking them down with me. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm already looking forward to the next conversation.
Thank you for having me.